Hey, good morning, everyone. Happy Monday morning to you, and welcome back to Morning Musings. My name is Don K. Preston. I am the president of Preterist Research Institute of Ardmore, Oklahoma. I appreciate you being with me. Hope you had a fantastic weekend. Now, before I get into my video this morning, I just want to let you know this is going to be a short week for me. Well, it's going to be really long in some ways, but anyway, beginning Wednesday, Daniel Rogers will be filling in for me. I have 3 days of some testing that I have to undergo, hopefully, prayerfully, and pretty confident. Doesn't amount to anything, but nonetheless, I have to endure it. And so, rather than try to work around that, I've invited Daniel to fill in for me. Don't know what he's going to share with you, but you know what? It will be good. So, with that said, all right, I want to get back into our discussion of the Great Tribulation. Now, don't forget, our dispensational friends say the Great Tribulation comes in the last half of the 70th week of Daniel, and it's still future. Now, in a future video or two, I'm going to prove to you that cannot be true. Absolutely cannot be true. And then we are told by men such as Greg Beale that the Great Tribulation has been going on since the first century. Well, in the first place, that is absolutely specious. It is to suggest that since the first century, the world has gotten worse, tribulation, anguish has gotten worse, is simply to ignore the reality of history. But that's for another discussion. What I've been sharing with you is that the Scripture ties the Great Tribulation to the first century, not beginning in the first century and extending for millennia, but beginning and terminating in the first century at the coming of the Lord. So those who say that we've been in the Great Tribulation ever since the first century are simply ignoring the biblical facts. Now, Jesus said, Matthew 24, verse 21, speaking of the Great Tribulation, "For then shall be great tribulation, such as has never been, nor ever yet shall be." Well, just recently, Sam Frost pointed out that that's typical Hebraic hyperbole. He pointed out, correctly so, that in Daniel chapter 9 and verse 12, Daniel described the BC 586 destruction of Jerusalem as something that had never happened like it before. And by the way, in Ezekiel chapter 5, 8 and following, the Lord himself said, "I'm going to do a work here that I have never done before, will never do again." So on a purely literalistic perspective, you can't say that BC 586 was the worst that had ever been, worse than anything ever or ever would be, and then turn around and say that 70 AD would be the worst that had ever been or ever would be. You can't take that language absolutely literally. Well, I don't have a problem with that, actually. Not really. I recognize the hyperbolic nature of that Hebraic language. Now, what's odd and self-contradictory and self-destructive is that only a few days after arguing that the language is hyperbole, not to be taken literally, Mr. Frost turned around and took it literally, saying that it couldn't be true. After all, there were 6 million Jews died in World War II. So on the one hand, Mr. Frost argued that the language is hyperbole. On the other hand, he applied it literally and denied that it could apply to AD 70. Well, such is the flip-flopping of argumentation of Mr. Frost. Now, is there a way, even taking into account the hyperbolic nature of the language, but is there a way that we can look at that language in a somewhat literalistic manner, not woodenly literalistically. Well, I think Kenneth Gentry pointed out a very viable possibility in which he said, if we look at this language covenantally, then literally nothing like it had ever been done before or would ever happen again. Now, when Mr. Gentry applies it covenantally, he destroys his own futurism, as I'll point out here momentarily. But what Mr. Gentry suggests is God had never, ever brought his covenant relationship with a covenant people to a termination prior to AD 70. But in AD 70, Yahweh terminated the old covenant relationship with old covenant Israel after the flesh. Nothing like that had ever happened before, and nothing like that will ever happen again. Now, by the way, Zechariah chapter 11 predicted this very thing. Now, here's what's interesting, absolutely interesting. Whereas in Jeremiah chapter 5 and Jeremiah chapter 30, the Lord said, although I will make a full end of other nations, the nations that he was going to bring against Jerusalem, by the way, yet I will not make a full end of you. Now, guess what? In Genesis 28:15 and following, the Lord said, I will never leave you, that's Jacob, i.e. Israel, nor forsake you until I have fulfilled all of my words to you and to your fathers. Uh-oh. So here we have a promise that Yahweh would never break his relationship with Jacob, i.e. Israel, that old covenant relationship, until he had fulfilled it all. Now, watch this. In Zechariah chapter 11, this stands in stark contrast to Jeremiah 30. It stands in stark contrast to the promise that I will not make a full end of you, but I will the nations. But in Zechariah chapter 11, verses 8 and following, the Lord said that in the last days, that's the application of it, the Lord would break his covenant bond with both houses of Israel. Do you catch the power of that? He had never done that before. Oh, and it would be in the day in which they would eat the flesh of their children. That's in fulfillment of Deuteronomy chapters 28 to 30, the law of blessing and cursing. Now look, when God said, I'm going to bring the covenant curses of Deuteronomy chapter 28 to 30 to bear on you when you eat the flesh of your children, that means that those covenant sanctions would be in effect imposed and binding when he did that. And yet in that same day, at that same time, Yahweh would break the covenant bond with both houses of Israel. So on the one hand, he would bring the full power of those covenantal sanctions to bear, and in fulfilling those, he would ultimately sever his covenant relationship with them. In the day they ate the flesh of their children. Now, I guess you know, hope you do, that Josephus records that in the siege of Jerusalem, and by the way, from the time of Zechariah until AD 70, we have no record of a siege in which anyone in Jerusalem ate the flesh of their children. But in AD 70, at that siege, they did. So this is the time of the fulfillment of Zechariah chapter 11, in which God said he would break his covenant bond with both houses of Israel. Oh, but he would make a new covenant with the house of Israel and Judah. One covenant world would end, another covenant world would be created. Oh, and do you know what that means? For then shall be great tribulation, such as has never been, nor ever yet shall be. Well, do you know what that means? That means that the new covenant world created by Jesus will never come to an end, which is precisely what Hebrews chapter 12, 25 and following says. God was going to remove the old covenant given at Sinai, and that which would remain when that was removed would never be removed. You know what that means? That means if we take Matthew 24, 29 from a covenantal perspective, you cannot divide Matthew chapter 24 and 25, because that means Matthew 24, 21 is talking about an unending new covenant. Well, that means that Matthew 24, 36 and following is not talking about the end of the new covenant age. Do you see the power of that? And so, while we recognize that Matthew 24, 21 can be viewed from a hyperbolic Hebraic hyperbolic perspective, it can also be taken in a literalistic manner, because while God terminated his old covenant relationship with Israel in AD 70, something he had never, ever done before, he created a new covenant people, a new covenant, heaven and earth, that will never pass away, completely establishing the unity of the Olivet Discourse, completely destroying any futurist eschatology. Hey, you know what? I discuss all of that and more in my book, The Resurrection of Daniel, chapter 12, verse 2, Fulfilled or Future. Go to my website, donkpreston.com, bibleprophecy.com. Order a copy of this book. You'll be absolutely amazed at how beautiful and harmonious this story is concerning the Great Tribulation and the end of the Old Covenant. Thanks for joining me. I have more on the flip side.